What if I told you that everything historians have taught us about the conquistadors' success over the centuries is hopelessly outdated? For a long time, we were fed the myth that a tiny band of Europeans managed to crush a mighty empire solely through the power of steel, gunpowder, and horses. But the real history of this war is far more complex and cynical.
The true foundation of this incredible campaign was built not on cannons, but on masterful.
At the very center of this conflict stood the city of Tlaxcala, a unique state that had been in complete economic and military isolation for decades. Surrounded by hostile forces on all sides, the Tlaxcalans lived for years under a state of permanent siege, yet never succumbed to the colossal pressure from the imperial center. It was precisely this impregnable bastion that ultimately became the very key that allowed the defenses of Tenochtitlan to be breached and the old world order on the entire continent to be destroyed forever. Without these people, history would have unfolded according to a completely different scenario, one that people today prefer not to recall. Be sure to watch this video all the way to the end, because today we'll explore the true hidden side of the Great Conquest.
You'll learn how the empire's most implacable and fierce enemies suddenly became the Spanish crown's most important strategic allies.
I will tell you why their greatest triumph on the battlefield turned into a final and tragic loss of independence for them. We'll examine documents that reveal the true role of the Indian conquistadors and understand who really shaped the history of the Americas during those fateful days. This investigation will turn your perceptions of colonization upside down, so stay tuned. We're getting started. Are you ready for the shocking truth about the start of this campaign? Hernán Cortés' expedition initially moved deep into the continent amid total uncertainty and constant depletion of resources. The Spaniards advanced through dense forests and steep mountain passes, losing supplies and breaking heavy equipment. Each new day of the grueling march took the expedition further from the coast and dashed any hope of a quick retreat to the ships. Scouts regularly reported the presence of large armed groups on the surrounding rocky heights. The detachment found itself trapped in narrow gorges, where the cavalry's advantage in maneuverability lost all meaning. The crossing of the mountain ranges led the conquistadors straight to the borders of the independent state of Tlaxcala. This territory was an impregnable valley, protected by massive stone walls and deep artificial moats. Local residents had spent generations building these complex fortifications to defend against constant invasions from the imperial capital. The Tlaxcaltecs lived under a state of permanent siege, conserving every gram of salt and cotton cloth. The harsh conditions of isolation had transformed the entire population into an incredibly disciplined and well-coordinated military machine.
The appearance of an unknown detachment of foreigners at their borders was perceived as yet another threat from their long-standing enemies.
The Spanish commanders attempted to conduct preliminary negotiations, sending envoys with proposals for peaceful passage through the valley. However, the Tlaxcala Council of Elders categorically rejected any diplomatic initiatives on their territory. They decided to demonstrate their power to the foreigners and block the expedition's further advance. Dense formations of local warriors, armed with obsidian swords and long wooden spears, appeared on the narrow mountain trails. The Spaniards' attempt to pass through the barricades led to an immediate tactical clash. For the first time, the conquistadors faced organized resistance that surpassed them in coordination and cohesion. The Tlaxcalan commanders also closely analyzed the course of the protracted stalemate. They noticed that the foreigners were making no attempt whatsoever to seize territory, but were merely stubbornly holding their fortified positions. The elders began to reasonably doubt the wisdom of a prolonged siege, which was severely depleting the valley's resources. The constant presence of a large armed detachment near their cities created unnecessary logistical strain. Soon, intelligence reported that the foreigners were originally moving toward the capital of the empire, their greatest enemy.
This information radically changed the strategic perception of the situation within the Tlaxcala ruling council.
The negotiations took place in an atmosphere of extreme mutual wariness and dry, pragmatic calculation. Cortés offered the Tlaxcaltecs his technological support in their eternal struggle against the Central Empire. The elders saw in the Spaniards the ideal tool for destroying the hegemony of their long-standing and powerful oppressors. An unprecedented military-political alliance was formed, one that forever changed the course of world history. The detachment immediately received the necessary supplies, experienced guides, and thousands of disciplined warriors to support them. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you agree with the elders' decision? Let me know in the comments, and be sure to subscribe to our channel. The secret that will change the conquest industry lies in this surprising alliance. The combined army of Spaniards and Tlaxcalans began a rapid and coordinated advance toward the heart of the mighty empire. The scale of the threat to the central government increased many times over, as the foreigners were now backed by a massive, disciplined local force. Tlaxcaltec scouts provided Cortés with accurate intelligence on the location of enemy garrisons. They charted safe routes around major outposts, preserving the crucial element of tactical surprise. The logistics of the entire expedition came entirely under the control of the new allies, ensuring an uninterrupted supply of provisions. On the way to the capital lay the large city of Cholula, considered the region's most important religious and commercial center. The city's authorities formally expressed their submission, officially inviting the Spanish detachment within their walls. However, the Tlaxcalans warned Cortés in time of a large-scale trap being prepared within the city's narrow walls. They pointed out deep pits camouflaged in the streets and clusters of armed men on the flat roofs of buildings.
The Spanish commander made the tough decision to launch a preemptive strike to avoid being completely surrounded in the labyrinth of alleys.
This drastic decision led to an immediate escalation of the conflict and an unprecedented display of destructive force. A detachment of conquistadors quickly blocked the central square, restricting any movement of local city militias. Artillery took up advantageous positions on the high ground, completely controlling the city's main thoroughfares. Tlaxcalan warriors securely blocked all exits from the settlement, preventing the arrival of any possible reinforcements from outside. Within a few hours, the disorganized resistance of Cholula's large garrison was completely crushed. The city's infrastructure suffered severe, irreparable damage, and the local authorities surrendered to the combined forces. This harsh tactical measure sent a clear, unambiguous signal to the capital regarding the extreme seriousness of the Allies' intentions. To secure his vulnerable positions, the Spanish commander took an unprecedented political step. He isolated the supreme ruler of the empire in his residence, effectively making him a high-ranking hostage. This act allowed him to temporarily control the complex situation through direct orders issued by the captured legitimate leader. However, hidden discontent among the local population and the influential nobility grew steadily with each passing day. The palace's resources were rapidly being depleted, and supplying the massive garrison placed a heavy burden on the city's infrastructure. The balance of power was maintained solely through fear and the unquestioned authority of the captive ruler. The situation took a sharp and catastrophic turn for the worse when Cortés was forced to temporarily leave the island city. The remaining garrison, succumbing to panic due to constant rumors of an impending uprising, made a fatal strategic mistake. The Spaniards harshly blocked off the temple square during a very important local festival. This hasty action provoked a massive popular uprising that instantly engulfed every single district of the capital. The Conquistadors and the Tlaltecans found themselves completely trapped in their quarters under a relentless hail of heavy stones.
The illusion of complete control collapsed instantly, giving way to a desperate struggle for mere physical survival.
A difficult decision was made to break through to the mainland under cover of night across the ruined stone dams. The soldiers hastily constructed portable wooden bridges to cross the wide water barriers. Laden with gold and heavy armor, the Conquistadors and their loyal allies set out into the pitch-black darkness. This retreat became the most catastrophic and devastating moment of the entire military campaign. The massive army dissolved into the chaos of the nighttime breakout, suffering colossal, irreparable losses in equipment and resources. Are you ready to learn how the Allies survived this terrible rout and managed to rebuild their strength for the decisive strike? What I am about to show you is banned in 12 countries. The infamous Night of Sorrow turned into a complete tactical and logistical collapse for the once invincible force of Cortés. The retreating columns stretched chaotically across narrow causeways, losing coordination in pitch darkness and under torrential rain. Heavy artillery pieces, supply wagons, and captured treasures sank without a trace into the depths of the lake. Local units in agile boats attacked from the flanks, methodically destroying the Spaniards' makeshift wooden bridges. The Tlaxcalan warriors, marching in the perilous rearguard, bore the brunt of the pursuers' assault. The cold dawn mercilessly laid bare the true scale of the logistical catastrophe that had unfolded during the night. The expedition had completely lost its artillery, most of its cavalry, and nearly all of its precious gunpowder supplies. The surviving Spanish conquistadors and their loyal allies were a scattered, utterly exhausted crowd. The balance of power was entirely against the supply-deprived Spaniards and the remaining loyal Tlaxcaltecs. Cortés lined up his exhausted men in a tight square, fully aware that there was physically nowhere left to retreat. It was a clash of utter logistical despair against absolute strategic confidence in victory. At the most critical moment of this confrontation, a small group of Spanish cavalrymen made an incredible breakthrough. They managed to fight their way through the dense ranks to the enemy's command center and eliminate the army's commander-in-chief.
The sudden loss of command instantly disorganized the vast but unwieldy imperial ranks.
The vast army faltered, lost formation, and began a chaotic mass retreat from the battlefield. This fortuitous tactical stroke of luck miraculously saved the remnants of the expedition from complete and inevitable annihilation. The detachment gained a vital respite and the opportunity to continue its journey to the safe borders of its allies. At the same time, the Empire's logistics faced insurmountable, large-scale internal problems. A deep administrative crisis was rapidly spreading across all major cities and remote settlements. Disruptions in food supplies severed basic communications and completely paralyzed the central government. The central government lost the ability to respond promptly and effectively to the actions of the United Allies. This unexpected logistical collapse radically altered the strategic balance of power across the entire vast continent. Internal weakness dealt the Empire a blow that proved more effective than any enemy artillery. Cortés launched a systematic and ruthless campaign to completely isolate the capital, capturing all coastal cities. The Tlaxcala units played an absolutely crucial role in holding the occupied strategic territories. They tightly controlled all lines of communication and completely prevented the enemy from bringing in fresh reinforcements. The ring of economic blockade around the vast lakeside metropolis grew tighter with each passing week. The aqueduct supplying the capital with fresh water was completely destroyed through the joint efforts of military engineers.
The siege entered a prolonged phase of systematic and ruthless depletion of the resources of the besieged defenders.
The final assault turned into a methodical and ruthless destruction of the entire complex urban infrastructure. The Spaniards and Tlaxcaltecs slowly advanced from block to block, demolishing buildings to ensure protection against ambushes. The defenders resisted with the desperation of the doomed, but their supplies and strength were rapidly dwindling. The majestic island capital was turning into smoking ruins, covered in stone debris and thick ash. The scale of this destruction was irrefutable proof of the final and irreversible collapse of the old order. If you were struck by this story of the Army's transformation and restoration, be sure to like this video. The secret that people pay thousands for lies in the consequences of this alliance. The fall of the ancient capital marked a complete and irreversible change in the political map of the entire region. The vast empire, which for decades had ruthlessly imposed its will on its weaker neighbors, ceased to exist. A completely new, ramified colonial administration began to take shape on its smoldering ruins. The Tlaxcalans, as the victors' principal military allies, expected a well-deserved, generous reward for their loyalty. They quite reasonably counted on an equal partnership in the governance of the conquered rich lands. The Spanish crown officially recognized Tlaxcala's enormous logistical contribution to the success of Cortés's expedition. A special royal decree was issued, granting the city-state a unique legal status of autonomy. The Tlaxcaltecs were completely exempt from paying most of the taxes required of other local conquered peoples. They were granted the exclusive right to carry firearms and ride horses, which was considered the highest privilege. These privileges firmly established their position as the new elite among the indigenous population of the New World. It seemed that the long, grueling struggle had finally borne its long-awaited and well-deserved fruits. Tlaxcala quickly transformed into a thriving center, actively integrating into the new colonial reality. The local nobility eagerly accepted Spanish noble titles while retaining control over their lands. They built magnificent stone cathedrals and administrative buildings, demonstrating their high status to all. The city became a vital logistics hub on the bustling route from the coast to the new capital under construction. The region's economic prosperity was built on solid legal guarantees issued far across the ocean. The system appeared incredibly stable and unbreakable, promising many years of economic tranquility. The Tlaxcala regular soldiers continued their service, becoming the main striking force in new campaigns. They actively helped the Conquistadors expand the boundaries of administrative control in the northern and southern territories. Their vast experience and detailed knowledge of the terrain made them indispensable army guides and fighters. These joint expeditionary campaigns further strengthened the formal political ties between the allies. Participation in new conquests brought substantial additional spoils and influence to the local elite. Military cooperation skillfully masked the gradual shift in the actual political balance of power. The consequences of constant participation in prolonged military campaigns and harsh working conditions reduced the population. The change in the familiar way of life altered the fate of the once great city. Integration and intermarriage gradually eroded the unique cultural identity of this proud people. New generations were inexorably losing touch with the history of their great, long-standing resistance. The ancient language and traditions were being supplanted by new standards, harshly imposed by the colonial educational system. Tlaxcala society was changing from within, permanently losing its cohesion in the face of external administrative threats. After 3 generations, the original historical agreements had finally lost their real legal force. Special status had become an empty formality, offering no real protection of economic interests. Tlaxcala had become just one of many ordinary provinces of a vast overseas empire. The people who had defeated all their powerful enemies were quietly and methodically assimilated into the new system. Their autonomy dissolved without a trace into the bureaucracy and harsh economic realities of the new era. It was the cold conclusion of a massive process of political transformation across an entire vast continent. The history of Tlaxcala vividly illustrates the paradox of any powerful tactical military alliance. A brilliant short-term victory all too often turns into a long-term and inevitable strategic defeat. The use of external global power to resolve local internal conflicts always comes at a tremendous cost. In this case, that price turned out to be the complete and unconditional loss of state sovereignty. The most powerful bastion fell not to siege or weapons, but to a slow dissolution into a foreign administrative structure. Do you think the elders had any alternative capable of preserving their independence under those conditions? An analysis of Tlaxcala's tactical decisions reveals an incredibly high level of military strategic planning. The city was skillfully divided into several independent sectors, each governed by its own leader. Such strict decentralization ruled out the possibility of a rapid seizure of power through the elimination of a single ruler. In the event of a surprise attack, all sectors instantly united their forces under a single military command. The flexibility of the political structure made their society extremely resilient to any external logistical shocks. It was this complex system that allowed them to successfully survive in isolation for many years. The fortifications of the picturesque valley were built with careful consideration of the complex mountainous terrain. Massive stone walls reliably blocked only the most vulnerable gentle approaches to the settlements. On steep slopes, artificial stepped terraces were created, significantly slowing the advance of any enemy. Deep moats and earthen embankments deliberately funneled attackers into narrow zones that were easy to bombard. The entire vast territory was transformed into a single defensive complex, organically integrated into the landscape. Engineering played just as important a role in their daily survival as the training of warriors. The economy of long-term isolation demanded the strictest discipline in the distribution of basic life-sustaining resources. Lack of access to the sea deprived the population of salt, which was critically necessary for preserving food. Trade routes were completely blocked by a hostile empire, forcing the development of internal self-sufficient production. Cotton was in dire short supply, so everyday clothing was often made from the coarse fibers of local plants. A harsh, ascetic way of life shaped the character of the people over the centuries, making them ready to endure any hardship with fortitude. Each generation was rigorously raised to be prepared to defend their meager resources with weapons in hand. The arrival of Cortés's expedition abruptly and permanently disrupted this long-established, delicate balance of power. The Spaniards brought with them tactics of total, destructive warfare that completely disregarded the old ritualistic rules. They actively employed artillery and heavy cavalry, which shattered the local people's customary patterns of combat. The Tlaxcala commanders quickly recognized the tremendous effectiveness of these new methods. They logically concluded that combining their disciplined infantry with the foreigners' technology would create an invincible army. This cold, pragmatic calculation became the main basis for the historic decision to form an alliance. The integration of the two different military systems took place right in the midst of grueling and arduous marches. The Spaniards skillfully organized shock vanguards that immediately broke through the enemy's first lines of defense. The Tlaxcalan maneuverable units followed behind them, thoroughly clearing the territory and securing control of the flanks. Such combined tactics allowed the conquistadors to conserve scarce gunpowder and spare their meager cavalry. The logistics of the entire campaign also relied entirely on the well-established supply networks of the local population. Cortés's expedition transformed from a small detachment into a fully fledged, well-supplied, massive army. The collapse of the old order led to a massive and rapid redistribution of spheres of influence in the region. Tlaxcala confidently took its place as the main political and military partner of the new colonial administration. The city gained unimpeded access to resources and trade routes that had been closed for decades. The population experienced a brief but incredibly vibrant period of unprecedented economic and cultural growth. This short period was rightly considered the golden age of their independent post-war statehood. However, it was precisely this rapid rise that laid the hidden foundations for future large-scale assimilation. Integration into the global colonial system inevitably eroded the boundaries of former autonomy. Local leaders gradually became part of the imperial bureaucracy, growing increasingly distant from their people. The economy was rapidly restructured to serve the needs of the metropolis, completely ignoring the region's internal needs. Tlaxcala had fulfilled its historical role as an ally and was no longer of value as an independent military partner. The machinery of colonial administration smoothly absorbed the city, turning it into an ordinary province. The unique military machine was carefully and ruthlessly dismantled, as it was no longer needed under the new conditions. Guess what happened next when diplomacy gave way to bureaucracy? The process of losing sovereignty proceeded extremely slowly and was practically imperceptible to a single generation. The Spanish administration persistently introduced new legal norms, gradually replacing the traditional established laws of Tlaxcala. Legal proceedings were increasingly and deliberately transferred to the jurisdiction of the royal courts in the new capital. This systematically stripped the local council of elders of their primary function, the right to administer final justice. Power quietly slipped from the hands of local leaders through hundreds of small, imperceptible procedural changes. The introduction of a new, complex tax system also played a colossally destructive role. Although Tlaxcala was officially exempt from direct taxes, indirect levies and trade duties emerged. These hidden taxes placed an unbearable, heavy burden on the artisans and farmers of the valley. Economic independence was eroded by the necessity of using the new currency and imperial standards on a daily basis. Control over all financial flows gradually but completely shifted to appointed officials. The city was finally losing the ability to independently formulate its budget and accumulate resources. The change in Tlaxcala's visual architectural appearance reflected profound, hidden social transformations. New government buildings of a strict European style were actively being erected in place of ancient structures. The city's layout was radically changing to meet the needs of new logistics and mundane administrative convenience. The old fortifications, which had once saved the city, were methodically dismantled for building materials. The city's physical space ceased to reflect its unique historical and cultural identity. Tlaxcala became visually indistinguishable from dozens of other standardized colonial settlements. The rural areas of Tlaxcala underwent a massive and ruthless reorganization of all land. Traditional collective communal lands quickly gave way to large private agricultural estates. Local peasants lost access to water and pastures, becoming completely dependent tenants. This radical agrarian transformation completely destroyed the foundation of the region's food security. People were forced to work around the clock on export crops rather than to meet their own needs. The economy of the picturesque valley became entirely dependent on external markets and price fluctuations. Tlaxcala's historical military function also underwent completely irreversible structural changes. With the end of the active phase of conquest, the need for a large local army disappeared completely and forever. Regular units were disbanded, and their experienced commanders were sent into retirement with a small stipend. The assimilation was incredibly successful, requiring not a single shot or grueling siege. The administrative system absorbed its loyal allies with the same ease as its enemies. History once again confirmed the inexorable logic of the expansion of any large-scale empire. Studying this long historical process provides an incredibly important understanding of the mechanisms of power. A brilliant military victory is merely the first, simplest stage in establishing long-term control. True, lasting conquest comes later through imposed laws, taxes, and education. Institutional pressure always proves far stronger and more enduring than even the most disciplined army. The fate of Tlaxcala is the most classic example of how the administrative machine grinds down sovereignty. In the next chapter, we will learn exactly how these bureaucratic mechanisms worked in practice. The continent's logistics changed completely after the major conquest campaigns ended. The authorities rebuilt the road network, focusing on mineral extraction in the northern regions. New, wide trade routes ran far from the historic and once important Tlaxcala Valley. This left the city's once bustling warehouses and logistics hubs completely empty. The economic center of gravity rapidly shifted closer to the ports and new silver mines. The region permanently lost its status as a key transit hub and source of enormous revenue. Along with trade, significant investments in the local urban infrastructure also vanished. Maintaining the bridges and roads within the valley now fell as a heavy burden on the residents themselves. The city treasury, deprived of its customary transit fees, emptied at an incredible rate. Scheduled repairs to stone buildings and aqueducts ceased due to a lack of funds and skilled craftsmen. The settlement began to visibly deteriorate, irrevocably losing its former capital city luster and grandeur. The obvious architectural decline became the most visible symbol of the loss of political influence. The valley's water ecological balance was also irreparably disrupted by large-scale engineering projects. The draining of neighboring large lakes to expand the new capital altered the climate of the entire vast region. The groundwater level dropped critically, leading to the rapid drying up of old, reliable wells. Tlaxcala's irrigation canals, designed for the previous water volume, became completely useless. Farming became an incredibly risky endeavor, requiring colossal additional physical effort. Uncontrolled environmental changes completed the process of the autonomy's economic weakening. The justice system had finally turned into a well-oiled mechanism for the legal seizure of property. The enormous court fees and the cost of hiring lawyers from the capital were prohibitive for most residents. Cases regarding the return of illegally occupied agricultural land were often dragged out until the plaintiffs' deaths. Court rulings were almost always issued exclusively in favor of the colonial administration or European settlers. Faith in the fair justice of royal law gave way to complete disillusionment and deep apathy. The legal system became a legal trap for those who tried to honestly defend their rights. Thus, Tlaxcala's centuries-old independence was destroyed without the use of any military force. Administrative instruments of control proved far more effective than any prolonged blockade or siege. Economic dependence, complex bureaucracy, and demographic decline did their destructive work. The victorious city proved completely unprepared for a protracted standoff with the state apparatus. Their brilliant triumph on the battlefield turned out to be merely a prelude to a crushing defeat in the offices. The outcome was entirely predictable for any system facing a superior organizational structure. The loss of political and economic power was accompanied by an incredibly deep crisis of local identity. For centuries, the Tlaxcala people had defined themselves exclusively through resistance to an external threat. When the enemy vanished and a powerful ally became their suzerain, the old frame of reference collapsed entirely. Society urgently needed entirely new points of reference, which were promptly provided by the colonial administration. Integration into the global empire was universally presented as the highest good and the logical course of history. Old heroes were gradually but steadily supplanted by new ideals established in the distant capital. The reorganization of urban space profoundly affected the daily lives of the residents of the picturesque valley. Traditional, open, bustling markets were replaced by orderly trading areas under the strict supervision of officials. The introduction of new imperial standards of weights and measures completely destroyed the old system of commodity exchange. The architecture of residential buildings also changed, strictly conforming to new building codes and safety regulations. The familiar, centuries-old rhythm of life was finally broken and replaced by a strict administrative schedule. The city became incredibly easy to govern, but completely alien to its own residents. The transformation of the established consumption structure became a powerful tool for social assimilation. Status symbols from the past were quickly supplanted by goods brought from across the vast ocean. European-style clothing became the definitive sign of belonging to high society. Ownership of expensive imported horses and steel weapons determined a person's standing in the new hierarchy. The abandonment of the traditional ascetic way of life was voluntary, yet took place under immense pressure from social expectations. The desire to conform to the new standards proved far stronger than the memory of their great ancestors. The Tlaxcala nobility were the first to accept the new rules of the game, desperately striving to preserve what remained of their influence. They sent their sons en masse to study at prestigious imperial institutions in the capital. There, the young men diligently mastered new manners, European law, and methods of governance. Upon returning home, they spoke and thought exclusively as representatives of the colonial administration. The gap between the new elite and the common people rapidly reached critical proportions. The leaders had completely ceased to understand the basic needs of those they formerly governed. No one remembered the agreements reached in the campaign tents of the Spanish conquistadors. The relentless bureaucratic machine had successfully completed the cycle of absorbing a once powerful ally. Formal legal autonomy had completely given way to absolute subordination to the imperial center. This stage of history vividly demonstrates the immense vulnerability of isolated systems in the face of global structures. Iron military discipline and bravery are utterly powerless against systematic administrative integration. Tlaxcala brilliantly won a grueling war on the battlefield, but completely lost the battle for peaceful life. Their historical fate was sealed the moment the very first alliance agreement was signed. The mechanism of cold imperial assimilation worked flawlessly, leaving not the slightest chance for preserving independence. The proud warrior people were transformed into a submissive and faceless class of ordinary taxpayers. Strategic analysis irrefutably shows that Cortés's allies made a rational choice at the time. The besieged and isolated Tlaxcala had no resources for endless resistance against the Central Empire. Their meager supplies were running out, and complete diplomatic isolation left no chance for a peaceful settlement. The arrival of armed Spaniards presented them with a completely unique chance to turn the tide with a single powerful blow. They pragmatically used the foreigners as a tool for the immediate destruction of their main threat. The enormous risk seemed fully justified in the face of imminent absorption by aggressive neighbors. However, they severely underestimated the long-term catastrophic consequences of intervention by a powerful external force. The wise elders of Tlaxcala thought exclusively in terms of local conflict and regional dominance. They had absolutely no understanding of the scale and ambitions of the global empire standing behind Cortés's expedition. To them, the Spaniards were simply a strong band of mercenaries capable of temporarily shifting the balance of power. They did not even imagine that officials, judges, and tax collectors would inevitably follow the soldiers. This fatal error in assessing the scale of the threat proved fatal to their sovereign statehood. The process of dismantling autonomy took place almost imperceptibly through the natural succession of generations of administrators. The first appointed governors still remembered Tlaxcala's merits and tried to maintain a semblance of respect, but their successors were guided solely by strict instructions from the ministries and financial plans. For them, the city's special status was merely an annoying obstacle to effective tax collection. The bureaucracy worked incredibly slowly, but with absolute ruthlessness, step by step stripping away historical rights. Every new administrative decision inexorably narrowed the scope of their political freedom. The tragedy of Tlaxcala lies in the absolute historical inevitability of the path it chose. Situated at the dangerous intersection of the interests of two vast empires, the city could not remain isolated. It had to make a difficult choice between swift destruction by its neighbors and slow assimilation by its allies. They chose the path that ensured the physical survival of the people and a short-lived military triumph. But this difficult choice set in motion an irreversible process of the complete dissolution of their statehood within a foreign structure. The price of physical survival turned out to be exactly equal to the loss of political independence. The study of this large-scale conflict goes far beyond a simple historical chronicle. It is an incredibly detailed analysis of the mechanisms by which complex organizational systems absorb simpler ones. For centuries, Tlaxcala's strength was based on unity, discipline, and military prowess. The strength of the colonial administration was based on law, economics, bureaucracy, and logistics. The clash of these two completely different approaches could have only one logical outcome. Effective state administration always defeats even the bravest army in the long run. The conclusion of this story is entirely devoid of spectacular epic battles and heroic defenses. The Tlaxcala state ceased to exist very quietly in the silence of offices and courtrooms. Their autonomy was revoked with the stroke of a pen by an indifferent bureaucrat on the other side of a vast continent. This is a stark historical reminder that true power is measured not by the number of soldiers, but by control over institutions. The memory of the great military alliance remains only on the dusty pages of old chronicles. In reality, the city became the most ordinary, unremarkable part of a vast colonial empire. When assessing the overall results of the collaboration between Cortes and Tlaxcala, it is essential to look closely at the bare facts. The conquest of a vast continent would have been absolutely impossible without the logistical and military support of the local population. The Conquistadors provided new technologies and striking power, but the Allies bore the brunt of the campaign. It was they who provided reconnaissance, supplies, carried the heavy loads, and held the flanks in bloody battles. The Spanish contingent was merely the sharp tip of a spear, the shaft of which consisted of thousands of warriors from the valley. Without this solid foundation, the ambitious expedition would have been destroyed within the first month. The post-war arrangement firmly cemented the dominance of the European colonial administration. All key political posts and control over resources passed to the governors who had arrived from across the ocean. Tlaxcala received only empty formal honors and temporary tax breaks that were quickly revoked. The distribution of the fruits of this victory proved to be completely disproportionate to the actual contribution to the military success. The Allies brilliantly fulfilled their task and were neatly pushed aside from the levers of real power. A policy of pragmatic utilization was quickly replaced by a policy of systematic and ruthless displacement. Infrastructural changes firmly cemented the region's utterly marginal position in the new economy. All roads now led to the new capital, ensuring the uninterrupted transport of valuable resources. Tlaxcala found itself permanently sidelined from the new trade routes, having lost its strategic logistical significance. The absence of major silver or gold deposits made the picturesque valley completely unattractive for investment. The region sank deep into prolonged economic stagnation for many decades. The once proud masters of the land were reduced to powerless service personnel in a global trade network. The experience of the military alliance between Cortes and Tlaxcala became the classic template for future colonial campaigns. Exploiting local tribal conflicts to establish external control was subsequently applied throughout the world. The principle of pitting opponents against one another brilliantly allowed for the conservation of resources and the minimization of losses among one's own troops. The subsequent covert elimination of the autonomy of former allies also became standard bureaucratic practice. No empire ever tolerates strong and independent partners within the territories under its control. Sovereignty is always, without exception, sacrificed to imperial unification and absolute controllability. In the end, the city-state of Tlaxcala traded isolation for a very short-lived military triumph. Through their joint efforts, they destroyed their main enemy, but were completely unable to preserve their own statehood. Their history is a tense chronicle of how a grand tactical success turns into a strategic catastrophe. They won the decisive battle outright, but completely lost the era of administrative transformations. The fall of Tlaxcala occurred without a single destructive artillery shot fired at its stone walls. The city simply faded away quietly and unnoticed into the vast cauldron of the new colonial reality. By studying these large-scale historical events, we see how the real mechanisms of power and control operate. Institutions, laws, and the economy reliably form the invisible framework of any viable state. The army can only temporarily protect this framework or quickly destroy an enemy's, but it is utterly incapable of replacing it. When Tlaxcala's military institutions clashed with the imperial bureaucratic machine, the outcome was a foregone conclusion. No amount of military valor could compensate for the enormous gap in administrative technologies. This is the harshest, yet absolutely inevitable law of the development of global human societies. A completely new, vast civilization rose from the ruins of old alliances and betrayals. The blood spilled on narrow dams, and in gorges became the strong cement for the foundation of a vast empire. Tlaxcala brilliantly played its role in this process and receded forever into the deep shadows of history. Their tactical achievements are actively studied in military academies, while their political mistakes serve as a warning. This is a very cold, tense chronicle of a clash of ambitions, where the one who controls the system always wins. The scale of the losses and the change in power refutably demonstrate the absolute ruthlessness of global historical processes. The history of Tlaxcala's fall and assimilation shows that true power is built on institutions, not on swords. Military triumph often becomes merely a prelude to a long and imperceptible process of losing sovereignty. This city's experience proves that bureaucracy and the economy subjugate peoples more effectively than any regular army. At what stage do you think the Allies missed their chance to preserve their independence? Be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new analyses of historical strategies and conflicts.